one of the things that actually caused us to speak earlier today, before there was a ceasefire, before there was anything, was a kind of new trending topic in these political streets, in these Middle East streets, and it was about racism. I've seen this so many times, both this tactic and this specific claim. A video is going around TikTok, and the video basically is saying that Gaza is defined by racism. That 11,000 Palestinians live in a neighborhood, a ghetto, a literal ghetto. They're forced to live there in this place called Abid, which means slave, and that Black Palestinians, Afro-Palestinians, etc., are treated as second-class citizens in
by
Gaza.
Israel.
Yes.
By Israel. Yes.
They say in Gaza, they say Hamas. They say non-Black Arabs are non-Black Palestinians. You know, just good old-fashioned regular Palestinians treat Afro-Palestinians and Afro-descendant Palestinians poorly, and then they also somehow connect that to what happens in Jerusalem, where they say that the African quarter there, the African people there have endured racism.
By Israel.
I love how you keep saying by Israel, because that's an important piece. So let's take a step back and first just help me understand, or help the audience understand, what actually is happening here. Are Palestinians of African descent, Afro-Palestinians, Black Palestinians, people who look like you and have your origins, are they treated poorly or wrongly in Palestine?
So I am an Afro-Palestinian. I am telling you, the propaganda that you're talking about that's circulating on social media is fake. It's not true. It's propaganda. I know now. I read about Israel basically giving a budget of $150 million to rebrand their image. I did not think that they will start with Black people. I mean, I did not think that they will start with Afro-Palestinians. These are the reality. For my entire life, I lived in a neighborhood where the Afro-Palestinian community that you, Mark, visited in East Jerusalem, that neighborhood is called Bab al-Majlis. Bab al-Majlis, the door of the Majlis, which is the Majlis, it's the community, the place where we welcome people. You know what Israel called that place? The slaves' prison. This is, we call it as Palestinians, Bab al-Majlis, they call it the slaves' prison. The Israeli IDF positioned itself outside the neighborhood. I don't know if you remember when you visited, from one end and another end. Constantly, they attack my community on a regular basis. You know what they call us? And since I was a child, I heard these words, kushi, which is an equivalent to the N-word. Every day I heard this word, you know, basically not only towards me, toward my father, my family, my entire family. The other word they throw at us is Arabim, Arabs. And guess what? Very often, racist Israelis storm my neighborhood, especially during the Flag March. I don't know if you ever heard of the Flag March, where the hundreds of racist, violent Israeli Jewish settlers storm our neighborhood, protected by the IDF. And you know what they chant? Death to the Arabs, death to the Palestinians, and all kind of degrading language, especially towards women, Another thing that I think is very important, you know, my neighborhood in East Jerusalem, not only they arrested many of my friends and my family members for simply being Black, but also very often they stopped my dad, who was very frail, even as he was going through his chemotherapy. And very often they will make him wait, lose his appointment at the doctor's, or drop his basically ID card on the floor in the winter because they wanted to see him on his knees. They killed our neighbor who was 19-year-old, Osama Jadde, who was actually running, not armed, nothing. He was rushing to donate blood and that was during the second Intifada. But there's also something else. It's not only to Black Palestinians. They do the same thing. to Ethiopians, Jewish Ethiopians. For many years, basically African refugees in Israel were called by ministers and public officials cancer, infiltrators. And then Israel had to admit publicly that they were injecting Ethiopian Jewish women without their consent and without their knowledge of Reparovera, which is to sterilize them so they could not have children. You know, the birth rate of the Jewish Ethiopian community, the Jewish Ethiopian Black community in Israel is 2%, the lowest of any other community, because for years, Israel policy was to inject these women, to sterilize these women without their consent, so they would not be Jewish Black babies. So I don't want to hear anything about how Palestinians treat Black people. Yes, there's some idiots sometimes that would say, you know, like in any society, but there's no systematic discrimination. This I reject entirely, this whole idea that we live in ghettos, that we're discriminated against. Yes, we're discriminated, all of us, against by Israel, by a state that was called an apartheid state, by the United Nations, and by every human rights organization, and by the International Court of Justice. And you know what? I wanted to come on air as a Palestinian, as an Afro-Palestinian, to specifically speak of this issue, because the thing that really upset me more than anything else, they're trying to use, again, Black Palestinians to sanitize and to basically whitewash their genocide.
That seems to be a big part of this for me. It's that at a moment where Palestinians are being killed indiscriminately in Gaza, and Black people, just like everybody else around the world, is saying, hey, this is wrong. It's almost as if they're saying, hey, Black people, stop worrying about us killing them because they don't like you that much.
Yes.
My thing is, even if every Palestinian in the world were racist, that still doesn't get, they're not. But even if they were the worst racists in the world, that doesn't give Israel the right to commit genocide. So it's obviously just a wedge issue. Now, the truth is, to your point, I have not experienced that. I have spent the last 10 years back and forth in your community in Jerusalem, and I've seen a lot of things. I've heard a lot of things. And like you, I've heard a few idiots here and there, and I've heard Arabs refer to the neighborhood as Habs al-Abid from time to time. But in general, it's referred to as the African Quarter. In general, it's referred to as Bab el-Majlis.
Bab el-Majlis.
Yeah. In general, the racism that Palestinians or that Afro-descendant Palestinians talk about, whether they live in Jerusalem or Jericho or Haifa or Akka or Gaza or anywhere, they say the racism they experience is as Palestinians. They've been racialized as Palestinians.
Yes.
And they are treated as second-class citizens, not because of their Blackness, but because of their Palestinianness.
Yes.
And I think one example that I'd love for you to talk about for a second is those Ethiopian soldiers that you mentioned. People used to think that somehow the Ethiopian Israelis and the Afro-Palestinians would just be like hanging out, having beers or having dinner together. And it's like, no, one is an occupier.
Yes.
One is on one side of the green line, the other's on the other.
Yes. And may I add something? This 2 years ago, I went to my sister died, and I went to the funeral to bury her. And I remember at the arrival at the airport, there was this Ethiopian soldier. And I remember, he was looking at my passport, and I could see, he could not withstand my gaze and my look. And he asked me the reason for my visit. And I said, you're holding an Israeli passport. Do you ask every citizen why they come here, or only people who look like me, or only people Arab? So he was shocked that I threw at his face that. And he said something like, are you accusing me of racism? I said, yes, I'm accusing you of asking a racist question that you would not ask another person. Anybody ever asked you when you come back to the country, what's the reason of your visit? He said, yes. And that's what shook me. I said, they asked you that? He said, yes, they asked me that. I said, do you think they ask white people that? And he just couldn't answer. I don't think he didn't want to answer, probably. He did not want to answer. But also, I remember in very, very often at the airport, the most racist airport in the world, where they ask you the most racist question. for example, one of the questions, like she asked me, a security lady, she asked me, how could an Arab woman afford a bag like this? Or it goes to the idea that we must be stupid. How can we make money? How can we be successful? Or even a more degrading question, why she stripped me naked. She asked me to strip naked, and she was cavity search me. She asked me if I had plastic surgery, and I said, no, I did not. Why are you asking this question? I said, because Black people look different. And I was shocked. It's like, what do you mean? And she started making, like, putting, and said, they have different noses. And I'm like, and I just looked at her. I said, how racist what you're talking about now? You know how racist what you're saying? We don't all look alike. White people don't look all alike. But
Right.
also, again, there's this, like, truly there's this, you could see that in also the society, the Yemenis, and who are from Yemen or from Iraq or from other places, the way they're treated in Israeli society are less than the people who came from Poland or came from Germany or came from Europe or from other places. Whiteness and supremacy is a thing. It's exactly identical. And I believe one of the reasons why these propaganda things are coming out now about Blackness, it's connected to the activism in the African American community and the solidarity movement, but also it's connected to the book of Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think they freaked out when people in the Afro-American community start making the link between Jim Crow, apartheid, and slavery and what Israel is doing. And I think this is the moment where they thought they're losing the narrative and they're losing support in America. And the only way they can garner that support or dominate the narrative again is with propaganda. This is how they export their fascism.
That is such an important point. All your points you're making are important, but this idea of right as the solidarity movements are getting stronger, we saw that in Ferguson. We saw that with all the delegations.
Yes.
We've seen that with all of the activist groups, and they've all mentioned Palestine and shown solidarity with Palestine. And then Ta-Nehisi Coates, the most decorated and celebrated writer in American culture right now, writes a book at considerable risk, professional risk. He writes a book that connects these dots for us, and suddenly we're getting tweets and TikToks and videos. And it's not new information. What they basically do is continue to trot out the same it's one poorly researched article in Gulf News. It's one propaganda paper that argues that Black people are so poorly treated and they're caged and it's awful. And even
excuse me, Mark, Gulf News, is that the paper from the UAE? Well, if they want to talk about racism, let's see how they treat basically their Indian workers, their Pakistani workers, or any worker that come from Southeast Asia. It's a disgrace that they're using propaganda basically to drive a wedge between communities because they're terrified. They thought that Black people are the likes of Rishi Torres, or the likes of Hakeem Jeffrey, who can go there and pretend he didn't see the discrimination. Hakeem Jeffrey, Hakeem, his first name is Hakeem, which means doctor in Arabic. It's an Arabic name. And Rishi Torres, if it wasn't for them being, basically politicians, they would be treated like you and me.
Right.
Exactly like you and me. If they lived in Hebron, if they were born and lived as Palestinians in Hebron or in Jenin or Ramallah or Deir al-Balah, they would be segregated, discriminated against, killed and butchered and tortured and probably raped in prison if they were arrested.
Wow. It's tragic that that's a reality for Palestinians, and it's even more tragic that we've somehow managed to ignore all of that, ignore all the violence of the genocide in Gaza, ignore all the violence that's been happening in the West Bank, from settler raids to unlawful arrests. And the only thing suddenly that the Zionist Hezbollah warriors can talk about is racism against Black. Suddenly they all care about Black people.
Yeah. They didn't care about Adnan al-Burish, the doctor who was tortured and stated man and raped to death. They don't care about Hussam Abu Safie, another doctor who saw his picture entering basically the tank after for the only crime that he wouldn't abandon his patient. His own family, Ilyas, his son, yesterday released a statement saying that his dad is being tortured, a doctor is being tortured. If we normalize this butchery against doctors, medics, journalists, babies, civilians, the bombing of schools and hospitals, the Gaza formula will not stay in Gaza, and we will all become Palestinians. Whether you live in Ferguson, whether you live in Denmark, we will all become Palestinians. If we don't stop this genocidal machine, we will all become Palestinians. And mark my word, we will all become Black Palestinians.